Welcome to the Bookshelf Edit, where we break down the best books in security, risk, leadership, and management in under 20 minutes. No fluff, no filler, just the key insights that matter. Each episode, you'll get key takeaways from top security reads and decide whether you want to take a deeper dive into these topics yourself. Plus, we'll have guest appearances from industry leaders sharing their perspectives, as well as author interviews. Let's get into it.
What makes a great leader in security and risk? It's not in the manual. That's the line the book opens with. And honestly, if you've ever been handed responsibility in a crisis with absolutely no guidance and a vague sense of dread, you already know that's true. Before I go any further, full transparency, I know Mike Gips. I like Mike Gips. I'm even quoted in this book. But, and this matters, I wouldn't be doing this episode if I didn't genuinely think this was worth your time. Mike is a genuinely brilliant man, and not in the performative LinkedIn thought leader sense. I like his brain. He thinks in systems, but he writes in stories. And that combination is surprisingly rare in security leadership literature. This book isn't trying to turn you into a superhero CSO. It's trying to help you survive and lead in the very messy, contradictory, and sometimes morally grey reality that many actually work in. And that's why it's timely, because we are no longer dealing with neat single-issue crises. We are dealing with overlapping threats, reputational landmines, cyber-physical convergence, and organizations that still think risk lives in a spreadsheet. This book is about what happens when the frameworks stop helping and leadership still has to happen. One of the book's quiet but consistent arguments is that leadership doesn't start when you get promoted. It starts wherever responsibility finds you. Mike writes, leadership extends beyond job titles and appears across life domains, from family to recreation to volunteering. And this is important because security as an industry still has a bit of a hierarchy problem. We tend to treat leadership as something bestowed rather than something practiced. The book repeatedly pulls examples from volunteer roles, informal leadership moments, and sideways career moves. And I think that lands because in security, most of us learned leadership the hard way, covering gaps, making judgment calls, and owning consequences before anyone gave us any kind of authority. So what I appreciated here is that Mike doesn't romanticize that. He acknowledges that informal leadership often happens because systems fail, but he also shows how those moments shape better leaders. For practitioners, the implication is simple but uncomfortable. If you're waiting to be allowed to lead, you're already behind. There's a strong thread throughout the book on convergence, and not the buzzword version. Mike is very clear that siloed security leadership is no longer just inefficient, it's dangerous. He writes, leadership that treats risks as separate domains is not just outdated, it's dangerous. What this book does well is move the conversation away from organization charts and towards fluency. Risk leaders now have to speak multiple languages: board language, IT language, facilities, and human language. And that's harder than it sounds. One of the subtler observations that runs through this book is that many leaders struggle here, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were rewarded for depth, not breadth. Mike doesn't say this explicitly, but it is implied. Some technically excellent leaders plateau because they can't translate. For security professionals, this matters because the future role isn't head of function, it's connector, broker, and sometimes diplomat. If you don't enjoy explaining risk to people who don't think like you, you're going to find the next decade very uncomfortable. And this was one of my favorite passages in the book because it quietly dismantles a lot of security ego. Mike says, you never really solve the risk problem, you manage it, which sounds obvious until you realize just how many organizations behave as if risk can be closed, ticked off, or finished. So there's a very strong emphasis here on anticipation rather than prediction. Good leaders are not fortune tellers, they're horizon scanners. And the book repeatedly returns to this idea that complacency, often disguised as confidence, is where risk leaders get into trouble. What's interesting is that it isn't framed as a failure of intelligence, it's framed as a failure of curiosity. For practitioners, this is a very useful mirror. If your risk posture hasn't changed in a year, ask why. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing happened yet. The book also tackles what many of us know to be true. Crises don't end cleanly anymore. Mike really leans into the concept of polycrisis, so overlapping, cascading crises that don't wait their turn. And this does quietly challenge traditional crisis leadership models, which assume a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that structure just doesn't hold anymore. And while the book doesn't offer a neat solution, and that's kind of the point, it does reframe leadership as something closer to endurance rather than resolution. There's an implicit acceptance here that leaders will often be operating with incomplete information, moral ambiguity, competing harms. And that won't be comfortable for everyone. And that's okay. But if you're someone who needs certainty before acting, then I would say Mike gently suggests that security leadership may be evolving away from you. So, who's the book for? This is for security professionals stepping into leadership without a safety net, risk leaders tired of performative frameworks, people who suspect that best practice often lags reality. Look, it's not a textbook. It's not trying to impress you with models. And occasionally, quietly, it assumes a level of professional maturity that not every reader will have yet. But that's part of its strength. It's not a shouty book. It doesn't oversimplify, and it doesn't pretend leadership is tidy. It meets you where you actually are, often tired, under-resourced, and making decisions that won't be universally popular. And it reminds you that leadership isn't about having all the answers. Sometimes it's about being willing to act when there isn't a manual and knowing you'll be judged anyway, which, frankly, is most of this job. So, as I mentioned earlier, full transparency, I know Mike, and I was genuinely excited to read this properly because I like how he thinks. What I wanted to do now is dig a little deeper into why certain themes show up again and again in this book and what actually sits behind them. Mike, thank you very much for joining me.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You have written and edited a huge amount over the years. Articles, standards, frameworks. But this book, to me, feels more reflective rather than instructional. So what made this the moment to step back and write something that's explicitly about leadership when the rules stop working?
Well, a lot of the things I've written in the past, standards, frameworks, reports, were really for somebody else or for a specific purpose. And I had to fit in the framework that somebody else set out for me. So I was writing for a particular group or for a particular objective, where I really wanted to write about something that was more personal to me and that I could put my heart into, and that I sort of, felt viscerally rather than to say, okay, here's a framework or here's technical language of how, workplace violence is defined like this, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to do something that kind of pulled the threads together of things I've witnessed, experienced, people I've met, stories that I've admired over my career, and something that just I thought would be fulfilling to me and useful for readers.
I think that sense definitely comes through very clearly in the book as well. And speaking of one thing that comes through really clearly, it's that leadership today very rarely comes with any kind of clarity or closure. So when you look at the environments that security leaders are operating in now, overlapping risks, reputational pressure, moral ambiguity, what do you think we still underestimate about that reality?
Really good question. And we are operating in a world of polycrisis. Every day there's something, our world is kind of upside down, crazy. Information is moving so quickly. Disinformation, it's increasingly hard to tell them apart. We've got multiple generations in the workforce that have different needs, different expectations. Um, some are resigned to uh, a future that they don't think that they're going to get. We have all sorts of social, um, political, economic movements that are colliding. But I think that out of all those things that make leadership difficult, I think that the most important thing is that we're losing human connection with everything moving to social media, AI. People don't speak on the phone anymore. It's rare to get, even a conversation. We're working from home. That what we're underestimating is I mean, it sounds very simple, but the human connection, knowing what people want, how they operate, how they can best be motivated. So it really comes down to all the complex things going on in our world with AI and everything comes down to human connection.
It's interesting because that lack of human connection as well, I think, is something that's causing leaders to struggle as well with really trying to land with their teams, right?
Absolutely. And especially, we're in a world of leading remotely where you might be responsible if you're in the UK and you might be responsible for leading teams in Germany and France and Singapore and in Brazil and in New York. And all these people, they're never going to meet in person or, once a year or once every while. So even if you have, you meet every month on Zoom or Teams or whatever, you're still, yes, that's better than, talking on Slack or email, but still people aren't really getting to know each other. They're not breaking bread together. They're not, connecting like on a real personal basis. So we're living in an environment where it becomes increasingly difficult to build a cohesive, loyal team and to instill true leadership values in our staff. So I see that as one of the main challenges.
Yeah, I think connection is such an important part of leadership as well. So it's quite a difficult place for leaders to be operating from in this new remote world. Another theme in the book is kind of convergence as a human problem, which I really liked. You're very clear that it's not a technology problem, it's a leadership one. So when you've seen convergence actually work in practice, what's usually happening at the human level that isn't happening where it fails?
Yeah. So one of the things I see is people are very hesitant to converge, say, cyber physical business continuity functions because they think they're going to lose out. Who's going to be the leader, and where where it doesn't succeed is where there's competition, where people are undermining each other, where you're waiting for to be able to strike. It's like, oh, we're going to get the budget, or this is going to favor us, or they're going to report up through our line. Where I've seen it succeed is where the either or it's not functionally converged, but the groups work together. There's equal communication, respect. There's cross training between the different departments. The physical side doesn't think it's superior to the cyber side, and vice versa. Or everything is kind of collected under one leader, say a chief risk officer, who owns multiple functions, who distributes budget fairly, who treats the different um, functions equally with respect, and brings them together and not doesn't isolate or silo them. So those are the hallmarks of a successful convergence program.
I guess that human piece as well is very often the hardest part to get right. And that is where things usually succeed or fall apart. You touched on one of the failures. It felt like what you're alluding to more is ego actually getting in the way of good leadership and good convergence. And there is a quiet theme in the book about letting go of control, of ego, and of the idea that risk can be solved. So, for leaders who've built their careers on being the expert in the room, what does that transition look like when expertise alone isn't enough anymore?
Yeah, expertise alone definitely isn't enough, though it is still indispensable. You're not going to succeed, in a risk, mitigation program or risk management program without expertise. But it's using that expertise, it's leveraging it, and it's getting the right blend of expertise and the right personalities, and it's sort of the right formula, and and adapting in real time, because risk isn't static. Risk is quicksilver. It evolves constantly. There are always different things happening. Your risk appetite is probably evolving. People's individual risk tolerances and risk appetites are changing. So it isn't a matter of expertise, but a matter of sort of bringing different areas of expertise together, knowing when you're not an expert, being able to bring in other folks, being able to curb your ego, as you say, and listen to people who may have different perspectives and know better than you do, or at least have a different take on it than you do. So I'd like to be able to say, here's the leadership formula. And if I'll put this in a box, and if you do all these things, it's great. You'll be a leader, just add water. I wish it were that easy, right? And my book just gets at some of the elements that you should be constantly be working on, constantly thinking about. But really, you need to develop people. And I think the most important part of leadership is developing people who can succeed you and see further than you do. And that's all we do is, obviously we want a good result. We want our companies to succeed, our organizations to succeed, but we want to instill those leadership principles and attributes into our current and next generations, and not just for succession planning, but to plant the seeds for the future.
I think as well, it's you don't know what you don't know, right? So,
Absolutely.
but that can be a difficult shift for a lot of leaders, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to unlearn, but it does show up very clearly once you're accountable for others.
The first sentence in my book, and I just read it to someone the other day because they said something very similar, is I quote Aristotle and Plato, all I know is I know nothing. And the point is that we should all be humble, and no matter who we're dealing with, they're going to know something. They're going to have experienced something. They're going to have insight into something that we have no idea. and it's valuable. You can find someone who you think, how they won't know anything, they know nothing about security. However, they don't necessarily need to know anything about security. They have a perspective that may be exactly what you need, someone looking at it from a different angle. So, yes, you have to lay down the ego. And I have that problem myself. I'm not saying that I'm like, oh, I'm a perfect servant leader and I will lay down and, I'm a vessel for other people. No, I think sometimes, yeah, I know best. So it's a constant, it's a work in progress.
Tell me, if someone reads this book and nothing changes in their day-to-day leadership, then I reckon they've probably missed the point. But what's one subtle shift in behavior, mindset, or even decision making that you would hope that readers carry forward?
I think that you should do something every day as a leader that grounds you. And here's a weird example. I play, and I mentioned this in the book, I play ice hockey on recreational teams. I'm not any good. It's like people are like, oh, you're good. Why don't you play in the NHL or whatever? It's like, no, 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 like 3,000 levels below that. But I like it, and it's fun. However, when we're practicing their game before a game starts, and people are skating and shooting around on the ice, at the end of, right before the game starts, there's a million pucks on the ice and someone has to put them in a bucket and no one ever wants to do it. And I say, I'm going to be the guy who puts it into the bucket, you know, because I am just, someone has to serve, others. And, it would be more, I guess, impactful if I was a really good player. I was the best player on the team and I was doing, but still, I mean, you know what? Like, this is a way to humble yourself and kind of give to people and show I'm probably the oldest person out there, but I know my place, right? I'm a leader on the team, but I try to lead by example. And that's like I'm not too highfalutin or too big to do the most basic, acts of service. And that's what I would say, to
I
do.
like that. And I think it's a good way to look and think about leadership over the long term. Also, something that people tend to really recognize only in hindsight or later in their careers. I think that feels like a very honest ambition. Last one.
Mhm.
Looking back at your own career, is there a version of yourself from 20 years ago who needed this book more than they realized?
There's a version of myself now that needs the book more than I realized. As I was writing these things, as a lot of it came from columns that I've written in the past, but more than half the book is brand new, and far more than half the book, there are some columns that were written in the past, but I updated them. And there these are things I struggle with constantly, or the reason I'm writing the columns often is that, how do I deal with this? How have I dealt with in this past? How am I going to deal with it? And what kind of advice can I get from other leaders who have grappled with this? The book is replete with interviews and quotes from people who I look up to or I've consulted with for their experience, for their expertise. Everybody from, a lot of chief security officers, but security managers, um, everywhere along the spectrum. So yeah, there's not only a version of me 20 years ago, there's a version of me now that grapples with this every day.
I guess if we're not evolving, we're not moving forward, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
That's, Mike, really appreciate having you. It's really good to hear the thinking behind the book in your own words. It's Not in the Manual is out now. We will include details to buy below. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on the Bookshelf Edit.